Chapter 6 Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 6 Troubles Gather About Ruth. The next day the weather was brave and glorious, a perfect bridal of the earth and sky, and every one turned out of the inn to enjoy the fresh beauty of nature. Ruth was quite unconscious of being the object of remark, and in her light, rapid passings to and fro, had never looked at the doors and windows, where many watchers stood observing her, and commenting upon her situation or her appearance. "She's a very lovely creature," said one gentleman, rising from the breakfast table to catch a glimpse of her as she entered from her morning's ramble. "Not above 16, I should think. Very modest and innocent looking in her white gown." His wife, busy administering to the wants of a fine little boy, could only say, without seeing the young girl's modest ways, and gentle downcast countenance, "Well, I do think it's a shame such people should be allowed to come here. To think of such wickedness under the same roof. Do come away, my dear, and don't flatter her by such notice." The husband returned to the breakfast table. He smelt the broiled ham and eggs, and he heard his wife's commands. Whether smelling or hearing had most to do in causing his obedience, I cannot tell. Perhaps you can. "Now, Harry, go and see if nurse and baby are ready to go out with you. You must lose no time this beautiful morning." Ruth found Mr. Bellingham was not yet come down, so she sallied out for an additional half-hour's ramble, flitting about through the village, trying to catch all the beautiful sunny peeps at the scenery between the cold stone houses, which threw the radiant distance into aerial perspective far away. She passed by the little shop, and just issuing from it came the nurse and baby and little boy. The baby sat in placid dignity in her nurse's arms, with the face of queenly calm. Her fresh, soft, peachy complexion was really tempting, and Ruth, who was always fond of children, went up to coo and to smile at the little thing, and after some peep-boing, she was about to snatch a kiss, when Harry, whose face had been reddening ever since the play began, lifted up his sturdy little right arm and hit Ruth a great blow on the face. "Oh, for shame, sir!" said the nurse, snatching back his hand. "How dare you do that to the lady who is so kind as to speak to Sissy?" "She's not a lady," said he indignantly. "She's a bad, naughty girl. Mamma said so, she did, and she shan't kiss our baby." The nurse reddened in her turn. She knew what he must have heard, but it was awkward to bring it out, standing face to face with the elegant young lady. "Children pick up such notions, ma'am," said she at last, apologetically, to Ruth, who stood white and still, with a new idea running through her mind. "It's no notion, it's true, nurse, and I heard you say it yourself. Go away, naughty woman," said the boy, in infantile vehemence of passion, to Ruth. To the nurse's infinite relief, Ruth turned away, humbly and meekly, with bent head and slow, uncertain steps. But as she turned, she saw the mild, sad face of the deformed gentleman, who was sitting at the open window above the shop. He looked sadder and graver than ever, and his eyes met her glance with an expression of deep sorrow. And so, condemned alike by youth and age, she stole with timid step into the house. Mr. Bellingham was awaiting her in the sitting-room. The glorious day restored all his buoyancy of spirits. He talked gaily away, without pausing for a reply, while Ruth made tea and tried to calm her heart, which was yet beating with the agitation of the new ideas she had received from the occurrence of the morning. Luckily for her, the only answer required for some time were monosyllables. But those few words were uttered in so depressed and mournful a tone, that at last they struck Mr. Bellingham with surprise and displeasure, as the condition of mind they unconsciously implied did not harmonise with his own. "Ruth, what is the matter this morning? You really are very provoking. Yesterday, when everything was gloomy, and you might have been aware that I was out of spirits, I heard nothing but expressions of delight. To-day, when every creature under heaven is rejoicing, you look most deplorable and woebegone. You really should learn to have a little sympathy." The tears fell quickly down Ruth's cheeks, but she did not speak. She could not put into words the sense she was just beginning to entertain of the estimation in which she was henceforward to be held. She thought he would be as much grieved as she was at what had taken place that morning. She fancied she should sink in his opinion, if she told him how others regarded her. Besides, it seemed ungenerous to dilate upon the suffering of which he was the cause. "I will not," she thought, "embitter his life. I will try and be cheerful. I must not think of myself so much. If I can but make him happy, what need I care for chance speeches?" Accordingly, she made every effort possible to be as light-hearted as he was. But somehow, the moment she relaxed, thoughts would intrude, and wonders would force themselves upon her mind, so that altogether she was not the gay and bewitching companion Mr. Bellingham had previously found her. They sauntered out for a walk. The path they chose led to a wood on the side of a hill, and they entered, glad of the shade of the trees. At first it appeared like any common grove, but they soon came to a deep descent, on the summit of which they stood, looking down on the tree-tops, which were softly waving far beneath their feet. There was a path leading sharp down, and they followed it. The ledge of rock made it almost like going down steps, and their walk grew into a bounding, and their bounding into a run, before they reached the lowest plain. A green gloom reigned there, and it was the still hour of noon. The little birds were quiet in some leafy shade. They went on a few yards, and then they came to a circular pool overshadowed by the trees, whose highest boughs had been beneath their feet a few minutes before. The pond was hardly below the surface of the ground, and there was nothing like a bank on any side. A heron was standing there motionless, but when he saw them, he flapped his wings and slowly rose, and soared above the green heights of the wood up into the very sky itself, for at that depth the trees appeared to touch the round white clouds which brooded over the earth. The speedwell grew in the shallowest water of the pool, and all around its margin, but the flowers were hardly seen at first, so deep was the green shadow cast by the trees. In the very middle of the pond the sky was mirrored clear and dark, a blue which looked as if a black void lay behind. "Oh, there are water lilies," said Ruth, her eye catching on the farther side. "I must go and get some." "No, I will get them for you. The ground is spongy all round there. Sit still, Ruth. This heap of grass will make a capital seat." He went round, and she waited quietly for his return. When he came back he took off her bonnet without speaking, and began to place his flowers in her hair. She was quite still while he arranged her coronet, looking up in his face with loving eyes, with a peaceful composure. She knew that he was pleased from his manner, which had the joyousness of a child playing with a new toy, and she did not think twice of his occupation. It was pleasant to forget everything except his pleasure. When he had decked her out, he said, "There, Ruth, now you'll do. Come and look at yourself in the pond. Here, where there are no weeds. Come." She obeyed, and could not help seeing her own loveliness. It gave her a sense of satisfaction for an instant, as the sight of any other beautiful object would have done, but she never thought of associating it with herself. She knew that she was beautiful, but that seemed abstract and removed from herself. Her existence was in feeling and thinking and loving. Down in that green hollow they were quite in harmony. Her beauty was all that Mr Bellingham cared for, and it was supreme. It was all he recognised of her, and he was proud of it. She stood in her white dress against the trees which grew around. Her face was flushed into a brilliancy of colour which resembled that of a rose in June. The great, heavy, white flowers drooped on either side of her beautiful head, and if her brown hair was a little disordered, the very disorder only seemed to add a grace. She pleased him more by looking so lovely than by all her tender endeavours to fall in with his varying humour. But when they left the wood, and Ruth had taken out her flowers, and resumed her bonnet as they came near the inn, the simple thought of giving him pleasure was not enough to secure Ruth's peace. She came pensive and sad, and could not rally into gaiety. "Really, Ruth," said he that evening, "you must not encourage yourself in this habit of falling into melancholy reveries without any cause. You have been sighing 20 times during the last half hour. Do be a little cheerful. Remember, I have no companion but you in this out-of-the-way place." "I am very sorry," said Ruth, her eyes filling with tears, and then she remembered that it was very dull for him to be alone with her, heavy-hearted as she had been all day. She said in a sweet, penitent tone, "Would you be so kind as to teach me one of those games at cards you were speaking about yesterday? I would do my best to learn." Her soft, murmuring voice won its way. They rang for the cards, and he soon forgot that there was such a thing as depression or gloom in the world, in the pleasure of teaching such a beautiful ignoramus the mysteries of card-playing. "There," said he, at last, "that's enough for one lesson. Do you know, little goose, your blunders have made me laugh myself into one of the worst headaches I have had for years." He threw himself on the sofa, and in an instant she was by his side. "Let me put my cool hands on your forehead," she begged. "That used to do mamma good." He lay still, his face away from the light, and not speaking. Presently he fell asleep. Ruth put out the candles, and sat patiently by him for a long time, fancying he would awaken refreshed. The room grew cold in the night air, but Ruth dared not rouse him from what appeared to be a sound, restoring slumber. She covered him with her shawl, which she had thrown over a chair on coming in from their twilight ramble. She had ample time to think, but she tried to banish thought. At last his breathing became quick and oppressed, and after listening to it for some minutes with increasing affright, Ruth ventured to awaken him. He seemed stupefied and shivery. Ruth became more and more terrified. All the household were asleep except one servant girl, who was wearied out of what little English she had knowledge of in more waking hours, and could only answer, "Iss, indeed, ma'am," to any question put to her by Ruth. She sat by the bedside all night long. He moaned and tossed, but never spoke sensibly. It was a new form of illness to the miserable Ruth. Her yesterday's suffering went into the black distance of long past years. The present was all in all. When she heard people stirring, she went in search of Mrs Morgan, whose shrewd, sharp manners, unsoftened by inward respect for the poor girl, had awed Ruth, even when Mr Bellingham was by to protect her. "Mrs Morgan," she said, sitting down in the little parlour appropriated to the landlady, for she felt her strength suddenly desert her. "Mrs Morgan, I'm afraid Mr Bellingham is very ill." Here she burst into tears, but instantly checking herself. "Oh, what must I do?" continued she. "I don't think he has known anything all through the night, and he looks so strange and wild this morning." She gazed into Mrs Morgan's face, as if reading an oracle.
"Indeed, miss, ma'am, and it's a very awkward thing; but don't cry, that can do no good, 'deed it can't. I'll go and see the poor young man myself, and then I can judge if a doctor is wanting." Ruth followed Mrs Morgan upstairs. When they entered the sick room, Mr Bellingham was sitting up in bed, looking wildly about him, and as he saw them, he exclaimed, "Ruth, Ruth, come here! I won't be left alone!" and then he fell down exhausted on the pillow. Mrs Morgan went up and spoke to him, but he did not answer or take any notice. "I'll send for Mr Jones, my dear, 'deed, and I will. We'll have him here in a couple of hours, please God." "Oh, can't he come sooner?" asked Ruth, wild with terror. "'Deed no! He lives at Llanglass when he's home, and that's 7 mile away, and he may be gone around 8 or 9 mile on the other side Llanglass. But I'll send a boy on the pony directly." Saying this, Mrs Morgan left Ruth alone. There was nothing to be done, for Mr Bellingham had fallen into heavy sleep. Sounds of daily life began. Bells rang, breakfast services clattering up and down the passages, and Ruth sat on shivering by the bedside in that darkened room. Mrs Morgan sent her breakfast upstairs by a chambermaid, but Ruth motioned it away in her sick agony, and the girl had no right to urge her to partake of it. That alone broke the monotony of the long morning. She heard the sound of merry parties setting out on excursions, on horseback or in carriages, and once, stiff and wearied, she stole to the window, and looked out on one side of the blind. But the day looked bright and discordant to her aching, anxious heart. The gloom of the darkened room was better and more befitting. It was some hours after he was summoned before the doctor made his appearance. He questioned his patient, and, receiving no coherent answer, he asked Ruth concerning the symptoms; but when she questioned him in turn, he only shook his head and looked grave. He made a sign to Mrs Morgan to follow him out of the room, and they went down to her parlour, leaving Ruth in a depth of despair, lower than she could have thought it possible there remained for her to experience an hour before. "I'm afraid this is a bad case," said Mr Jones to Mrs Morgan in Welsh. "A brain fever has evidently set in." "Poor young gentleman! Poor young man! He looked the very picture of health." "That very appearance of robustness will, in all probability, make his disorder more violent. However, we must hope for the best, Mrs Morgan. Who is to attend upon him? He will require careful nursing. Is that young lady his sister? She looks too young to be his wife." "No, indeed. Gentlemen like you must know, Mr Jones, that we can't always look too closely into the ways of young men who come into our houses. Not but what I am sorry for her, for she's an innocent, inoffensive young creature. I always think it right, for my own morals, to put a little scorn into my manners when such as her come to stay here. But indeed she's so gentle, I've found it hard work to show the proper contempt." She would have gone on to her inattentive listener if she had not heard a low tap at the door, which recalled her from her morality, and Mr Jones from his consideration of the necessary prescriptions. "Come in," said Mrs Morgan sharply, and Ruth came in. She was white and trembling, but she stood in that dignity which strong feeling, kept down by self-command, always imparts. "I wish you, sir, to be so kind as to tell me, clearly and distinctly, what I must do for Mr Bellingham. Every direction you give me shall be most carefully attended to. You spoke about leeches. I can put them on, and see about them. Tell me everything, sir, that you wish to have done." Her manner was calm and serious, and her countenance and deportment showed that the occasion was calling out strength sufficient to meet it. Mr Jones spoke with a deference which he had not thought of using upstairs, even while he supposed her to be the sister of the invalid. Ruth listened gravely. She repeated some of the injunctions, in order that she might be sure that she fully comprehended them, and then, bowing, left the room.
She is no common person," said Mr. Jones. "Still she is too young to have the responsibility of such a serious case. Have you any idea where his friends live, Mrs. Morgan?"
"Indeed, and I have. His mother, as haughty a lady as you would wish to see, came travelling through Wales last year. She stopped here, and I warrant you, nothing was good enough for her. She was real quality. She left some clothes and books behind her; for the maid was almost as fine as the mistress, and little thought of seeing after her lady's clothes, having a taste for going scenery along with the manservant. And we had several letters from her. I have them locked in the drawers in the bar, where I keep such things. Well, I should recommend your writing to the lady, and telling her son's state. It would be a favour, Mr. Jones, if you would just write it yourself. English writing comes so strange to my pen." The letter was written, and in order to save time, Mr. Jones took it to the Langless post office.
Chapter 6